Good afternoon in the United States and good evening in Europe. My name is Anders Åslund and I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasian Center. Today, I have a great pleasure to introduce a panel to you of good friends of mine and outstanding specialists on the Russian economy. And we have 4 people on this panel. I'll take them in alphabetical order. We have Dr. Sergey Aleksashenko, who's a former Deputy Minister of Finance and Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Russia, and has also been in private business and academia for many years. We have Dr. Sergei Guriev, now Professor of Economics at the Sciences Po in Paris, but has previously been the chief economist of EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and for many years, president of a new economic school in Moscow, which was an outstanding institution. And Vladimir Milov, who's a Russian opposition leader and the leading economist in the circle around Alexei Navalny, and also a very good television host on YouTube. You should watch him. And finally, Elina Ribakova, who's the deputy chief economist at the Institute of International Finance here in Washington, and previously has worked at various investment banks. And what we are going to discuss today is the state of Russian economy. And we had a similar discussion half a year ago, last May. And we will look at the various sides of the Russian economy. I hope that we will have a quick discussion. I pose the questions to the panelists, and for the audience, you are most welcome to write your questions into the Q&A function on Zoom, and I will use your questions and read them out. You can do them with name or anonymous as you like. And the idea is that we will have a moderated discussion for 40-45 minutes, and then 15 to 20 minutes I will take the questions that I've had. But if I summarize the Russian economy in 2 words, that has been pretty much the same for a very long time, but for the last decade or so, it's macroeconomic stability, but no economic growth, stagnant. And Elina, you are all the time looking up on the macroeconomic situation. Could you elaborate a bit more? Which do you see as the big issues? Say 3 big issues for the Russian economy in the short term.
Well, thank you so much, Anders. It's a great pleasure to be in such a distinguished company. The short answer to your question is none, right? In the short run, we have stability compared to any other emerging markets. We have no government debt. We have no external debt, very high reserves. You would think this is fantastic, right? But the issue is that over the medium term, we have all the possible imaginable problems, and that is inability to generate higher potential growth. And why is that happening? Because over the previous 20 years, we've mostly relied on commodities, and that has generated a certain sense of complacency in terms of regional development, and also the way we're thinking about fiscal federalism. And there is an interesting sort of connection between different issues. You would like to diversify the economy from oil. You would like to promote competitiveness in the economy. You would like to have stronger regions. But unfortunately, given the current political structure, that makes this economic changes almost impossible. And I look forward to discussing that more shortly with you.
Yeah, I mean, what you really say, it is Russia is a severe case of energy curves. Vladimir, you are working in Moscow and in the regions. What do people really feel about the situation in Russia, and I'm not thinking on the political side, but more what are Russian people's greatest economic concerns today?
Thank you, Anders. And it's always great to be in the company of best friends. And it's also good to have a cross check every 6 months as to what happens with the Russian economy. Now, on the ground, people are getting more and more outraged. I'm not exaggerating. I think that's the word. Because basically, yeah, we all have been hit with these lockdowns and the impacts of pandemic in spring. But then again, everybody, including Russia, expected more or less swift recovery. That's actually the rhetoric that you have been hearing from the Russian authorities. That after a deep plunge because of the lockdowns, things like more or less will be continuously growing back to normal. Now, this hope is rapidly fading. I'm sure you saw the October statistical numbers. They are worse than September and August. So actually, we have like a second round of decline before, in the middle of the year, Russian government central bank has formulated the situation as stabilization at a lower level. Стабилизация на пониженном уровне. Don't even have that anymore. So what October curve shows you is that economy started to decline again. And I think the fourth quarter might be even worse than some of the previous grim expectations. I would say the major contributing factor, because authorities have decided not to reintroduce lockdowns this time because they understand that it costs them a lot politically. People don't like it. So they decided to go through the second wave of pandemic without introducing lockdowns. And I think it's not the major factor contributing to renewed decline. I think the major factor is that there's been very, very little financial aid from the government to assist difficulties with the first wave. And right now, the authorities say that there will be none anymore. There is no aid package being discussed or planned. However, the financial safety net of the ordinary Russians, of the small and medium-sized businesses, have significantly eroded. Plus, another important factor, what has been supporting some sort of growth that we had in the previous years was massive growth in retail credit. People actually borrowed money to substitute decline in incomes. Now, that is coming to an end. You can see a lot of criteria showing that. Standard & Poor's recently published a report saying that the era of healthy growth of consumer credit in Russia is over, meaning that if the growth is still to follow, it's going to be unhealthy. People will borrow, but will not be able to repay because their incomes are in sharp decline. So I think politically it has great implications. Everybody was like more or less happy in like July, August, September, that this COVID thing seemed to be over, and Putin was saying that, like, you know, we had victory over this coronavirus and so on. But right now, and together with it, we have been largely promised the beginning of like things going back to normal economically, more or less, maybe not swift but steady recovery. Now these illusions are crashing, and this is already having a lot of political implications, particularly heading into next year Duma elections. So we will see more and more discontent. I think it will inevitably translate into political attitude towards Russian authorities if these negative trends, which we saw in October, if they persist.
Yeah, Vladimir, at the same time, Russia is having less of an economic decline probably. It will probably be 3 or 4% this year than any other countries, really. So COVID seems to hit more politically and that people have more regret. So I think it's quite important what you say, that they have taken so much before. So therefore COVID comes as the last straw in Russia, so that it's taken worse. I'm quite amazed. Elina touched upon it, how very conservative the budget policy is in Russia. So Russia probably has the smallest budget deficit almost over any country around, and the least declining GDP, but at the same time, this reaction that you mentioned. Let me follow up. We have seen now in Khabarovsk, if I remember rightly, you have been to Khabarovsk and visited, and the big demonstrations every Saturday. Are they still continuing? And what are there economic motives there, or is it all about the governor who was sacked by Putin?
Well, first, Anders, about the relatively mild numbers of GDP decline. First, the fourth quarter is not over yet, and the trend that we saw in October is negative. So, I mean, let's not just finish our analysis right here. Probably things can get worse. Second, these relatively mild numbers have been achieved at one very important cost, and political cost, because people were basically forced to spend all they got, spend all their financial reserves, which they did. So now, right now, the financial safety pillow of the population of small and medium-sized businesses is dried up. That's the cost of a relatively mild, like 4 or 5% decline in GDP. Now, in Khabarovsk, not really. I think in Khabarovsk is more political than economic, because what happened in Khabarovsk in the past couple of years is a complete overthrow of the rule of United Russia Party. So they have been kicked out of the governor's seat 2 years ago, and then completely kicked out of the legislature. And essentially, people liked what happened afterwards. What they're doing right now, obviously the demonstrations have shrunk in size because they've been out for like 5 months. That's a lot already, but they will reemerge. We can talk about this later. And the perceptions have only worsened about Putin and the government and so on. But this was not so much economic as much of a demonstration of approval that people liked the new governorship, which had a totally different governing style than United Russia. Like, we decide everything behind closed doors and just tell you the result. What Sergei Furgal, the arrested governor, did, he introduced a totally different style of management, of governance, and people liked that the authorities have sort of turned their face more towards the people and broke away from this absolutely non-democratic system of making decisions and so on. So they came out on the street defending this. I think it's far more than the economic factors specifically which contributed this year.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. Sergey Aleksashenko, you recently wrote about the change of government in Russia. This is something that has gone completely unnoticed in the Western media. First, that Russia got a completely new government in January, that Mikhail Mishustin replaced Dmitry Medvedev as prime minister. And now again, last month, we saw half a dozen changes in that government. What is going on? Here we expect that there is complete stagnation, and then we have all these personnel changes. What is it about?
It's about Putin's personal fatigue. I think he's tired to be 20 years in charge of everything what's going on in Russia. And sometimes in previous years, he mentioned, I need a more efficient government. I want them to make decisions. I want them to find solutions. But every time they come to my office and ask me what to do, I don't want to have this. And it was evident that while Dmitry Medvedev was in this position, he was afraid to demonstrate any political ambitions in order not to be sacked. Yeah, because he dreamed, and I believe he's dreaming up to now to re-become a president of Russia as Putin leaves. And that's why definitely Medvedev was not interested in this position, was not interested in any activity. And it is it's on the one hand, it is surprise, but I believe that it is linked to the changes in constitution, that Putin wanted to get more political responsibility, more political power, and at the same time to give all day-to-day issues to someone else. He looked at, if you look on his administration in Kremlin, you may see that in recent years, he has replaced all his old friends with new guys. They are, let's say, 35 to 45 efficient managers, effectively manager, yeah, who has no any political ambitions, but who wants to demonstrate their loyalty to Putin. He looked around and found only one guy, similar guy in his government. It was Mikhail Mishustin, who by some rumors is believed to be an efficient manager, at least in digitalization of communication of taxpayers with the tax authorities. And he gave him this power to reshuffle the government and to create a new government. 9 months have passed. The government was in a new position after COVID. And I think it was Mishustin's initiative who came to Putin and said, Vladimir Vladimirovich, look, I cannot work with this minister, with that minister. They are too weak, and we need to make some changes. And Putin said, yeah, do it. It doesn't matter for me. If you replace A by B and B by C, I don't care. They have the same guy, the same puppets in your hands. And that's why I want to reiterate. I believe that is Putin's personal fatigue of day-to-day care, and to a certain extent, his trust to Mishustin as an efficient manager.
So, but this most recent change you pointed out on economist website that these new people are much older. They are already pensioners by Russian standards. Why such old people? When Mishustin came in, we heard that these were younger technocrats. Now we are getting older apparatchiks instead.
I think this reshuffling of the government, these changes in the government, to a certain extent, were unexpected by Mishustin. On the one hand, he initiated those changes. On the other hand, he has no a big team or a long list in his phone book. He needed to look around and not to find only an efficient manager, but to find an efficient manager loyal to Putin and accepted by Putin. And if you look, for example, on position of Minister of Transportation, and this ministry is in charge of huge budgetary expenditures on the road construction, on railway construction, and so on and so forth. And of course, Putin cannot deliver this position to unknown guy who will be in charge of spending billions and trillions of rubles. And that's why in this position we found Vitaly Savelyev, who is a personal friend of Putin for more than 25 years. So that's a combination. Политика есть искусство возможного. The policy is art of possible.
Thank you. Then I understand better, and I noticed that you did not mention the word reform, so I'm not even going to ask you about it. Let me turn to you, Sergei Guriev. You have worked a lot on the softer sides of the human condition in Russia, and both on happiness and the state of health. And what are you thinking now with regard to the COVID situation? Vladimir talked a bit about it, and how do you see the Russian policy on the coronavirus?
Thanks, Anders, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great panel, great honor to speak here. I indeed would pick up where Vladimir left it, talking about the impact on the Russian economy. And I fully agree with you, Anders, that relative to where we stood half a year ago, Russian economy is doing better. We are projecting something like -4%. IMF is a bit more pessimistic. Kudrin is even more pessimistic. But if you look at OECD is a bit like IMF. Russian government is a bit more optimistic for 2020. Just half a year ago, we would project -6, -7, -8%. And the decline in GDP in 2020 is not as dramatic. While other countries, as you rightly said, are doing much worse. Advanced economies on average will lose 6%. Many European countries will lose 10% of GDP. And even US will lose more than 4%. And in that sense, it looks like a puzzle. And I think the key to the puzzle is exactly your question. You cannot just analyze GDP, you need to think about why. And the answer why is Russian government chose economy over health. If you look at the policies, the lockdowns were not really enforced in the spring. And also whenever lockdowns were imposed, Russians neglected lockdowns because Russian government was stingy. Russian government's economic support measures were much smaller than those in the West, and actually even on average less generous than those in emerging economies. If you look at the IMF Fiscal Policy Monitor, this is publicly available data comparable across countries, Russian fiscal support is below 3 percentage points. Advanced economists rolled out on average 10 percentage points of GDP. And so it's much, much more generous. So we shouldn't be surprised that Russians didn't sit at home. They did walked around, they did go to work. And there are data that you can look up at Google and Apple websites which show you the mobility data, how much Russians were sitting in one place, how much they spent in shops, in parks, in workplaces. And you see Russians were much less disciplined than Italians or French. So we should not be surprised that death rates are very high. Now, this is where we have yet another challenge. Russian government statistics are not to be trusted, so you really need to look at excess deaths, excess mortality, and these numbers are horrible. There are different ways to look at these numbers. There is a former Rosstat demographer, Alexei Navalny, who worked at Rosstat until he started to talk about those issues. So he now is an independent demographer since summer. And so his analysis is based on the comparing what's happening now with the pre-2020 trend in mortality, which was declining. And if you look at his estimates, up until now, we are talking about something like 200,000 extra deaths, which is a huge number. And by the end of the year, his estimate is 300,000. So these are huge numbers. Even if you look at official data are much, much smaller. And the reason for Russian government to be softer on lockdown measures in the spring is, of course, explainable. Putin needed a military parade, Putin needed the vote, so he, as Vladimir correctly said, declared that we won this war against the coronavirus. And right now we see great increase. Right now we see that both official and unofficial mortality measures are increasing greatly, and this is a major disaster. And this is a choice of Russian state: preserve the economy, preserve the sovereign wealth fund, and then convince Russians that they are not dying, because official data are showing that they're not dying. And so this is pretty scary, but this is how I would explain the fact that Russian economy is not doing that badly. Another issue here is, of course, we don't know what's going to happen early next year. The vaccination efforts are about to start, but the Russian vaccine still has not still completed the third stage of tests, so we don't know how effective it is. So this is not over yet, but I think one of the biggest challenges is what we can see for the next year is the Russian budget. Russian government just adopted the next 3-year budget, and it's very clear in what it's signaling. It's preserving spending for law and order, so-called law and order agencies. It's preserving spending for propaganda, for state media. It's cutting spending on healthcare. And this is a very clear signal what the priorities are. And I think this is scary, but this is one explanation why we don't see a major decline in Russian economy, and we see a major increase in mortality.
This is very interesting. And what you're really saying is that Russia should have a Keynesian policy, and it has, on the contrary, an extremely conservative macroeconomic.
This is actually a puzzle. Russia has a sovereign wealth fund, and it's not spending it. And the question I get a lot wherever I speak about those issues, why? And I don't have an answer, except that Russian government is waiting for a yet more rainy day, a rainier day. It is a rainy day, but probably Russian government is expecting to see lower oil prices, which is probably realistic. And maybe Russian government is also preparing for the situation Lukashenko is in right now, where you need to pay your policemen. And at that point, you do need those, whatever, 10 or 12% of GDP to go through a political problem where you need to have a loyal police, and you need to have cash to pay the police, even if oil prices are low.
And do you have any view of this Russian vaccine, Sputnik 5?
We still don't have data. So this vaccine is still undergoing the tests. Whenever Russian government says, well, our vaccine is 92% effective or 95% effective. It's based on 20 individuals. It's really scary to what extent all this is propaganda. It may be a great vaccine, it's just not ready yet. It's not enough. There is not enough.
Yeah, thank you. Elina, let me turn to you, and let's turn to more structural issues after having got the big overview questions. One of the big issues in recent years, and particularly this year, has been the low oil price. How serious is that? And perhaps if I ask you about the impact of the sanctions also, I know that you have written about that recently.
Thank you. I think on the oil price, it is not as serious as it might seem. As we saw this year with oil price at 20, they probably will run out of buffers maybe in a year, because it's never quite linear. It always turns exponential. So even though in the budget it might look like you can last 3 years, and they did put those numbers out, if you run through the adjustment on revenues and also pressure on the expenditure from oil, lower GDP growth as well, then you quickly end up in a scenario where this current buffers will probably last you a year. But nonetheless, we're not quite expecting immediate oil prices at 20 to stay for the next couple of years. It is not a shock that I think the authorities are so much worried about, or should be worried about, given all the preparations they have done for this external threats. What they are worried, and I think carrying over from Sergei and others who just said a second ago, is they're worried about more geopolitical external pressure, and that's what they're saving money for. That's the only concern. And it is ironic that over time they might actually not get it, and let's talk about what the US administration might or might not do. Where they might get the shock actually is the internal shock from the regions, from people who saw that they're being ignored, from the healthcare spending, from the lockdowns, potentially also from the vaccine. And that pressure will continue building, because we don't have regions that are contributing to the common pot of the transfers between the regions from the sort of fiscal division of revenues. We only have oil and gas regions contributing to that. Everybody else is taking money from it. And over the last 5 years, they've been getting less and less and less money, and more pressure. And the irony, as we talked also last time, unfortunate irony, is that now we need to have the healthcare spending. And I would always even sort of controversially disagree on the Keynesian part. I think it's almost, people should have been looked after. But at this stage, it's almost irrelevant, because the healthcare infrastructure doesn't exist. So you could have supported people maybe on the margin, but the problem is that the regional healthcare units cannot look after people who are sick with COVID, and that's it. So the only then decision from the center is, I'm going to save the economy, pretend it's not happening, and I'm going to trade off lives for sort of propping up and keeping growth. And I think that's the critical issue. On the external threats front, we actually might get somewhat less than we expected. Partially, we haven't seen the talks about the US elections meddling. And also, you might have seen over the summer, some of the foreign policy experts who are likely to go or sort of into transition team, they have been going, and also possibly in the administration, they began to talk about maybe on certain issues we need to start having negotiations or sort of discussions with Russia. And one of them is maybe nuclear, maybe there could be other green ideas. So you might actually have a cautious sort of maybe standstill towards Russia. And also some of the measures that they have discussed before, which is either SWIFT or sovereign debt sanctions, Congress and staffers and Treasury has looked through it, current sort of bipartisan sort of staffers. And as much as they would like maybe to do more, they are concerned about the global financial stability spillovers. So that's why it's not obvious what kind of sort of the big bang measures that we have seen in 2014 could happen again. And for the repeat of 2014, the current authorities are very well prepared. And just before I pass on, since we're talking about growth, I've been looking at I think it's Izvestia from November 1990, and it has a wonderful chart in terms of approval ratings. And some of you remember that very well. I'm sure Sergey Aleksashenko remembers some of it. It's 89 to 1990. And there is Army, KGB, and KPSS. And the one that suffered the most in terms of approval rating into the years is actually KPSS. Army and KGB is holding up very well for that time being. And it's interesting that 20 years on, we're sort of discussing a similar macroeconomic sort of political situation, unfortunately, and then still puzzled why we're not having stronger productivity growth.
Interesting. Sergei Guriev and Vladimir, you have both written extensively about oligarchs. And I remember, Sergei, quite a few years ago, you wrote about oligarchs, the productivity of oligarchs. But why is the Russian economy so dominated by old industries and state-owned enterprises? In any list you find top Gazprom, Rosneft, Sberbank, the order changes a bit, and then other state banks and oil companies and big metallurgical companies. Possibly Yandex pops up somewhere at the lower end of the 10 top companies. Are the oligarchs becoming less productive than when you wrote about them? You're muted, Sergey.
Sorry, this is a great question, and indeed, when I wrote about this, I thought why oligarchs are more productive than other private businesses, and of course more productive than state-owned enterprises. And one explanation would be that exactly because they're oligarchs, because they have political connections, they create different rules of the game for themselves. And in that sense, we shouldn't be surprised. Another more benevolent explanation, benign explanation, would be that they have concentrated ownership, so they overcome conflict of interest between managers and shareholders better, and so on. But by now, as we know a lot more what has happened 20 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, we see that many of the oligarchs, unfortunately, became rich not because of the management expertise, but because of political connections. Now, what has happened in the last 10 years, of course, was crowding out of oligarchs by the state-owned enterprises or by new oligarchs, and we shouldn't be surprised here as well. One of the things you mentioned was state banks. I think this is very interesting. So what happened with the state banks and private banks? Private banks could choose whether to compete with the state banks or not. If you compete with the state banks, you also have to be taking a lot of risks, like the state banks. And then when it's time to pay, it turns out that the state will bail out the state banks, but will take over the private banks and kick out the managers and wipe out the shareholders, which is how it should be, I guess. But this uneven playing field between private banks and state banks has completely destroyed the business model of private banks. So a large private bank can choose to be conservative, and we know there are private banks like this. Alpha Bank is probably the only one in top 10, the only private bank which remained on board. But most state banks just benefit from this business model. You take excessive risks. When you lose money, the government bails you out and doesn't kick out the management. And with that, private banks cannot compete. And the central bank over the last 7 years cleansed the system of bankrupt private banks, which only left state banks in power. And this is the essential anti-competitive policy that Russian government has carried out in recent years. You support state companies no matter what. You support Gazprom, even if Gazprom's management has not done a good job. You support Rosneft management, even though Rosneft management has not done a good job. You put competitors of your friend in jail or kick them out. And so you shouldn't be surprised that we have domination of companies with better political connections. The only difference between now and early 2000s is the oligarchs of late 90s and early 2000s were not Putin's friends. And whoever is more productive or just bigger today are closer to the current leadership. That's the only thing.
Very interesting. You can say that the oligarchs in the 1990s, they were self-made businessmen. Putin's oligarchs are Putin-made businessmen. And,
yeah, one 1990s oligarchs told me about one Putin oligarchs. We should give them their due. They've never made any money without government's support.
Yeah. Vladimir, you recently wrote that the oligarchs are new entrepreneurs, which follows very much on the same line. Can you explain what you meant? And I always used your analysis of Gazprom about the kleptocracy in Russia. Is this really just a matter of kleptocracy, or do you see any entrepreneurship left in the big companies?
Well, yeah, first, Anders, I think there's a very simple explanation why the Russian economy evolved over the past 20 years from a relatively more competitive and having more different actors competing with each other to a more condensed system of monopolies, cartels, just a handful of people controlling major strategic sectors. That is definitely, it's connected with two issues. First, with kleptocracy, obviously, because it's easier to control the cash flows for the personal benefit. So essentially, the government and Putin, obviously himself, they were looking at various industries. How can they establish control over their cash flows for their benefit? It ended up with either their structures swallowing the players in these sectors, or they got an agreement with somebody else who were private oligarchs before about money sharing, if you will. Second factor, obviously, it's politics, because it's much easier to control the political system if you control a handful of strategic players who dominate the major economic sectors, right? So that's, I think, the explanation. It's a symbiosis of both personal enrichment plus political reasons. It fits perfectly into that. But also, I think it's important when we talk about oligarchs in the economic sense. I think it's important to have a breakdown, because they are of different types. Sergey started this. I wanted to pick up a bit. I would say there are several types. First, like totally new oligarchs which did not exist in the 90s. The oligarchs which dwell on state procurement, who supply services, like they build pipelines for Gazprom and enrich themselves through that, become a profit and totally new profit center. Like we've been asked, like politicians, what you gonna do with Rottenberg and Timchenko when you get to power? We say there will be no Rottenberg and Timchenko. They will disappear overnight, because whatever we're gonna build or invest in is gonna be procured through an open tender. So other people would come in who would simply win because they will be more efficient, and this is how it works. Now, the second part are the oligarchs which are affiliated and take major posts in state companies. Essentially, these are different companies, from oil and gas, Sechin and Miller, to Chemezov and manufacturing and defense. But bottom line, it all comes down to receiving major benefits from the state. Direct benefits or major tax benefits or whatever. And this is what they dwell on. Now, third group is state banks, which Sergei talked about. There's a huge imbalance developing in the Russian economy right now, because economy is in decline or stagnation for many years. At the same time, you see record profits of banks, the largest part of which are profits made by just a handful of biggest state banks. Now they use that. They take these profits and use them for redistribution of control. They buy tech companies, they buy retail players like VTB bought Magnit and so on. So that is, I think it's quite clear that the lack of competition in the Russian banking sector and excessive profits of state banks are the major instrument of redistribution of control of the economy. Now, the rest, there are some leftovers, private oligarchs who are private owners and were left from the 90s, but they found their way to make an agreement with Putin. They also traded major benefits in return to their political loyalty. Like just yesterday, you can go to my Twitter account. I posted a table that Oleg Deripaska's Rusal, the aluminium producer, is virtually paying zero taxes. Zero taxes. Basically, if you go, even the government has been, like Belousov has been raising the issue that the steel makers are paying virtually very little taxes and so on. So we need to increase that. So that's another part where they still, they are more efficient in managing their assets as private businesses, but there's still some sort of disproportion, because through that political agreement with Putin, they contribute less to like financing social infrastructure and so on. So this, I think overall, this also reduces and distorts the efficiency of the economy.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll look here at the questions that are coming in, and there are a lot of them. And I want to mention specifically Golfo Alexopoulos writes, I want to thank Sergey and Vladimir for great YouTube shows that I watch regularly. So I just passing on the compliment from our audience. And I also see here a question from Roman Bichiboy about what new sanctions that are to be expected from the new government. Elina has already answered that question, but I would like to turn that to Sergey Aleksashenko, since you did a very good report for us at the Atlantic Council a couple of years ago about the impact of sanctions. And if you could mention how strong you consider that the impact of the sanctions is, and what you expect from the Biden administration. Unmute.
Thank you, Anders. It's a good question because in recent weeks there are a lot of talks about potential sanctions, though I do not believe they will materialize. I think that US desire to harm Russian economy, to make some decisions that will make the life worse or hard for Putin, evaporated somewhere in mid-2016. After what the real sanctions that are written on the paper, they do not work at all. Yes, of course, there is a dozen maybe of banks and companies, or big banks and companies that are under sanctions that cannot raise finances from the Western capital markets. But due to the fact that all other Russian banks and companies can borrow abroad and even place their shares, okay, the redistribution of foreign exchange in the domestic market allows all those Rosneft, VTB, and so on to get enough of foreign exchange and to pay their debt or to invest in their projects. I am very skeptical about any personal sanctions that were imposed on roughly 300 Russian officials, militaries, intelligence, and so on, because all of them, maybe except of Rottenberg, had no assets that were frozen abroad, and definitely it's not their desire to travel outside of Russia in this time. The only real sanctions, personal sanctions that were efficient, that were sanctions against Oleg Deripaska, imposed 2 years ago, and when he virtually lost not only control over Rusal, but he lost all beneficiary rights. So he cannot receive any profits, any dividends from this company, and he cannot nominate his managers. So he may rely that sometime in the future, maybe 10 years later, 20 years later, he will restore his property, his ownership, but it's under the question. So I would say that at the moment, despite all what we can say about Rusal and its sophisticated tax evasion policy, in fact, that is the company that is run and managed by independent managers who are not dependent on owners. But all the rest, I think that the Trump's administration demonstrated very well that Russia is a competitive partner in the military sector, in the military arena, and United States US administration has a lot of issues to negotiate with Russia, starting from the nuclear weapons, then Iran, then North Korea, then the Middle East, and so on and so forth. And in the situation when when Putin does not implement any radical decisions, any radical steps, any radical violation, let's say a new aggression, invasion of Ukraine or invasion of Belarus or annexation of some part of those countries. Now, what's the reason? What's the reason to punish Putin, to impose on him any sanctions? Because that will not allow to make any deal. Donald Trump was a deal maker and is a deal maker, and definitely he dreamt all his 4 years in the office to sign any big deal. Would it be North Korea? Would it be Iran? Would it be Putin? But he failed, and definitely being a very experienced negotiator, very experienced real estate manager, he understands very well you have no permanent friends and permanent enemies. You have situations. And of course, if you want to reach a deal with one of the enemies, you should not harm him. And in this situation, I believe that Biden's administration, incoming administration, will be more or less in the same position. On the one hand, definitely it will be necessary to agree upon nuclear weapons. On the other hand, from what I see and from what I can understand, for today's administration, for this administration, for the next administration, for the whole Washington political establishment, China is more existential threat because China demonstrates ready to compete in economic field. Yes, China declared that they want to reach military parity somewhere by 2027, but what is most important for the United States is competition in the economic sphere and the desire of China to become a dominant technological economic player in the world. And that is undermining the United States superiority, the United States dominance in the global economy. And that is unacceptable for Washington. And of course, no one administration, no one great power may fight against two enemies at the same time. To fight against Russia and to fight against China, you as a president of the United States have to decide who is your number one opponent. And of course, it will be China. And of course,
Sergey, let me interrupt you here. I think that Biden knows Europe and the former Soviet Union extremely well. Remember that he became vice president because of a war in Georgia. 11 days after the war in Georgia in 2008, Obama chose him because he needed a tough person on the former Soviet Union. So he is very committed. He went to Ukraine 6 times as a vice president. He's very committed to the defense of Ukraine and also to its reforms. I think that we will see quite a restructuring of the sanctions on Russia so that they make sense. Since it has not simply been a fight between the Congress and Trump, and therefore the Russia sanctions, as they have developed since 2018, you took up the Rusal example, have been a mess. Rusal was too big to sanction. And now I think that we will see clear, if you, Russia, stop with this behavior, we will do away with certain sanctions. So I think it will be much clearer to the Kremlin what the situation is. And Tony Blinken knows the former Soviet Union very well, and so does Jake Sullivan. These are heavyweights. So I think that we will see something quite different, and also that sanction policy will move back to the State Department. Now it has been entirely a matter of, or almost entirely a matter of the Treasury. Steve Mnuchin has been in charge of the sanction.
We shall see. I agree with your thoughts and your view that Biden himself and his foreign policy team knows Eastern Europe, knows Russia, knows the CIS space very well. That's true. But after Joe Biden was nominated in charge of this region by President Obama in 2009, 11 years have passed, and the situation has changed, and the role of China has changed, and the behavior of China has changed. And my argument is, I completely agree that US foreign policy will be more consistent, will be more, not rules, but principle-based against Russia. But my position is that if Putin will not invade of Ukraine or invade of Belarus once again, there is no reason to impose tough sanctions on him. Of course, if he will use Novichok once or twice or 3 times more, there may be some other personal sanctions, but they will not harm Putin's economy. And I do not believe that any personal sanctions may shake Putin's political regime. I believe that in the 21st century, there was only one successful example of sanctions, that were sanctions against Iran.
Yeah. Let's leave that beside our topic. Yeah. I have lots of questions, so I will ask pretty much whoever wants to answer the question, show your hand, and I can pass them on to you. And if we can try to take 1 minute for each answer. Stephen Fisher, who was head of Citibank in the former Soviet Union, makes the point that the Russian stock market in US dollars is down 25% this year, while the Chinese stock market is up 25%. Anybody who wants to comment on this? Elina?
Hi, Steve. I think Steve still remembers the time when we talked about high potential growth in Russia and we really cared about the stock market. I think now, given the external sort of the focus on lack of external vulnerability, it's all about fixed income. Flows continues to fixed income, but I think until we get more to the stock market, it's just sort of validates this conversation. So I'll leave that minute here.
And take the point also that the sanctions are good for the bond yields, so investment bankers are not necessarily against them. Another question here is Paul Vanderen, the former EU ambassador, is what will happen to Russia's energy exports now with the green policy in Europe? Sergei Guriev, you are sitting in France. What do you think?
Well, I think the question is rather for Vladimir Milov, but what I can say, it's not just what's going to happen by 2050 or 2030. It's arriving much sooner. The new EU budget will include carbon tax, and there will be definitely carbon tax border adjustment, because European producers will say we will not want to compete with dirty producers. And so there will be some kind of carbon tax adjustment. And so Russia will have to respond somehow. Right now, we just hear that Russia is unhappy. So we mentioned Mr. Medvedev, Dmitry Medvedev, a few times today. He wrote an article saying this is unfair protectionism. But it's good that the Russian government at least pays attention. And yes, it will be very difficult for Russia to export to Europe. And Europe has been the most important export market. Now, Russia may export somewhere else, but the green taxation is becoming global. And now with US rejoining Paris Agreement, I think Russia will have to do something else. But what will happen? Russian ruble will depreciate in real terms, and Russian commodities will still remain more or less competitive.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, I got the same question from Matt, whoever that is. I have a question for you, Vladimir, from Alex Bachman. What do you propose to do to the members of Putin's mob?
Well, it's a long question because obviously we also do not want to turn Russia's future into this, spiral of political revenge. We would somehow have to move on. But obviously, they have stolen a lot, and we have discussed this. Anders, you wrote a great book on this. How much stolen and dirty money is being kept in the West, with the West not really tackling the issue. One thing we would obviously pursue is that I think I'm even supportive of the idea of granting some sort of amnesty. Like, in South Africa, after apartheid, they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Like, if you testify and tell everything, you might be cleared out of the stuff that you did. I think it's very important financially because we need to return a lot of corrupt capitals that were taken out, and this had contributed to Russia's decline and stagnation as well. This is a substantial part of capital flight, which goes uninterrupted for more than 12 years now. And we haven't seen net income of capital since the first half of 2008. So we need to get it back. We're going to take a lot of legal means to pursue these corrupt capitals which are harbored out there across the world. We need this money back to work for our pension fund, to work for financing the social infrastructure. So I think that's the most important question, save the revenge part.
Yeah, this is a big issue to come. And if the Corporate Transparency Act goes through here in the United States, the situation will change very much. I have a question here from Ambassador William Courtney, who has been ambassador to various countries of the former Soviet Union. To what extent does the Kremlin think the better relation with the West might improve the economy? Who's the taker on that question? Who, Sergey Aleksashenko?
I think that after 20 years in power and 15 years of the third Cold War with the West, Putin does not believe in good relations with the West, and he has no any trust to Western politicians. I believe that Putin believes that not isolation, but импортозамещение, substitution of import and self-reliance is the best policy for Russia. And that repeating the phrase that Russia has no permanent friends except of army and fleet and navy. And that's why theoretically it's good to have access to Western technology, but Putin believes that the West will not give it this at any price, even if Putin will sign any agreement on nuclear weapons, even if Putin give up Ukraine. So my short answer, Putin does not trust West at all.
Very interesting, very clear answer. Vladimir, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I agree with Sergey that Putin, I think, has completely given up on any attempts to build bridges with the West. He considers the West fundamentally hostile. But I disagree that sanctions are not having any impact, because I advise you to read an interview of Finance Minister Silvanov, which he gave in May during this peak of the pandemic. And this goes back to the question, why did they prefer to keep the National Wealth Fund and not spend it? Because they said, we cannot borrow. We borrow at 6% for all the combination of reasons, but sanctions are an important part of it. So Russia's only slightly added to its debt, but you see how the costs skyrocketed for the federal budget. So we cannot borrow as much as the Western governments can at near zero rates. That's the major issue. And this, no matter what Putin thinks, this is a pressing issue for Russia to rethink its foreign policy, because there is no alternative. We can't go to debt markets, and sanctions play a great part in that.
Interesting. I have another slightly related question here from Paul Carter, former US Consul General in Yekaterinburg, who wonders how much of a drain on the economy have the Kremlin's foreign adventures been in such places as Syria, Libya, and the Central Africa Republic, etc. And thus the economic pressures that we are talking about create a window for a deal on Russian withdrawal from Donbass. Sergey Aleksashenko has already said no to that question, so then I'll pass it on to somebody else. Elina.
I just want to comment in terms of the hidden expenditure in the budget. That number is now well into double digits. And this number started growing over the last 5 years. And there are nice research studies done that trying to identify it. And we started first picking it up, I think, literally in post-2014. And while it's natural for countries to have some small portions, maybe, of hidden expenditure, but such a large part of spending being fully hidden from transparency, and then also earlier deals where the banks give some payments to the military bloc and then there are repayments, sort of the obscure schemes, I think is just an indication of how much is possibly going to these various adventures directly. Then indirectly, as Vladimir also pointed out, in terms of cost of borrowing, Russia compares extremely well to other emerging markets. But imagine what Russia would look like if it also didn't have sanctions hanging over it. It would be a completely different country. But on the US side of affairs is, and many of you remember what happened with the WTO and Jackson-Vanik amendment, which pretty much almost never was taken off, although it lost its relevance completely. So I think Russia also lost an opportunity with codification of sanctions, and the bar is just so much higher now to be able to come back to the negotiating table to remove sanctions. I would put it even less than 10% probability in the coming years.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you. We have reached the witching hour. It's exactly 1 o'clock, and thank you very much for all your very substantial answers. This was exactly what I think we needed, and I hope that our audience think the same. Let's do this again in half a year's time or so. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.